Hello, everybody, and welcome to Your Best Game Ever. This is a video series to go along with the book, Your Best Game Ever, which is a tool book, not a rule book, for helping folks find their best games ever. Whether you're a player or a GM, no matter what RPG you're playing, and no matter your experience level, this is a book that you can find great actionable advice in. So I'm really excited to be talking with Monte today about how to outline and get ready to create your own adventures. So this is a topic that I'm pretty new to, but I'm pretty excited to discuss with you. So Monte, you have some experience writing adventures, I hear.
I've done an adventure or two. Yes.
Excellent. Do we want to talk a little bit about definitions as we think about what, especially for as your best game ever really is about no matter what RPG you're playing, there's lots of craft that we can, learn from, right? And is cross compatible. So what do you think about when you think about an adventure or a session?
Well, so certainly when talking about creating adventures for your home game, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about published adventures here. This is an
Mm-hmm.
adventure you create for your players. I think that there needs to be kind of a recognition that adventures are kind of bullshit. And what I mean
Do
by
it.
that is, like, most people don't play games where there is like a very firm beginning, middle, and end, right? It becomes
Mm.
sort of much more like, you might design, if you're playing D&D, you might design a dungeon, but the players might go in and kind of poke around in the dungeon for a while and then leave and go do something else and
Yeah.
then say, hey, let's go back and check that dungeon again, right? And go back and right. It's much more dynamic and
Yeah.
fluid and organic than sort of these compartmentalized,
Mm.
we're going to play this adventure and then we're going to play this adventure.
Mm-hmm.
So really, adventure is just a catch-all word, I
Yeah.
think, for what the player characters rather, what do they
Mm.
do, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, when because you've been doing a lot of game mastering lately,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Do you think about when you're thinking about it, do you look at it from the point of view of, okay, I'm going to create this interesting place
Mm.
and then the players are going to go there, or I'm going to come up with some interesting events, some things to
Mm.
happen, and those are going to unfold, and that's what the players are going to deal with. What do you like one of those versus the other, or do you
Yeah.
where do you gravitate?
I So one thing I like about picking more kind of event-based adventure design, or a thing that's going to happen, is that I could cheat and put that thing wherever they end up going. So if they surprise me by going somewhere else, I could also mess around with the exact location of things. But I think having an event means I can kind of spring that on them at any time, and so I've often designed around that. Um, but one thing I've really liked when I have tried to design around a location, like kind of like a classic dungeon crawl, right? Like
Right.
coming up with a really cool place to go explore. I, as a player, really enjoy that. I love like going into all the rooms. Like I'm very about that for some reason. Video games have trained me well. I want to go in all the rooms. Um, but one thing I like about if I did come up with a map or something is that it makes things a lot clearer, right? Like I don't have to often if I'm there is an answer, and I could even put the map on the table, and then I find that the players are excited to go check out what's this space on the map, right? And so it takes away some of the like cognitive load for me as a GM of holding all of the spatial information in my head. So when I do have a really like robust location, I found it really fun and easy to GM. That's sort of exploratory, but it's work. It's work ahead of time, which I do not like.
I think you've summarized that perfectly. I think it is more work ahead of time
Mm.
to do a location-based adventure, but it's much easier to run at
Yeah,
the table, right?
yeah.
A- And at the same time, I think the other advantage that the location-based adventure is that it it puts the players very much in the driver's seat,
Yeah,
right?
great point.
Even the most sort of basic thing, like, okay, there's a hallway to the left and a hallway to the right. Well, which way do we want to go? I guess we'll go right,
Yeah.
right? And that's their decision. It's not some extraneous force. It's not some
Yeah.
NPC telling them to do a thing. Like I was kind of joking about before, right? Like the players can decide to leave the dungeon and go do something else, right?
Right.
They are in control. That's pretty interesting. But event-based adventures, I guess they have the potential to make the players feel more significant because um, because an event-based adventure is sort of like an if-then statement, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the players do this, then this happens, right?
Yeah.
And so you're showing the players exactly the consequences of their actions,
Mm-hmm.
right? If they, take the MacGuffin into the cave, right? This thing will happen, and it won't happen if they don't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, like they're sort of in the driver's seat in a different way there, right?
Yeah. Right.
That what they do matters. That's a good
They
feeling,
kind of know what the levers are, or they think they do anyway.
right?
They get to decide when to pull it. Um,
Right. Or even if they don't know that it's a lever, they know it's a lever after they've pulled it, right? Oh, I
yeah.
didn't know that was going to happen if we took the MacGuffin into the cave, but now we do, right?
Yeah. One thing I've played around a lot with is like what motivates players to like actually engage with the adventure I theoretically prepped, right? So if it's something that I spring upon them, right, like your pocket is picked, this is the event, this is the triggering event of the
Right.
adventure you're about to be on. I know you're going to be mad that their pocket was picked, probably, and go engage with the stuff I've prepped. If I've plopped you in a dungeon, maybe you have to get back out, then I know you're going to be engaging with it, right? But like, I guess, there's got to be other ways to motivate them too, right? If players have a lot of investment in that story, that can motivate it. But time is kind of an interesting variable to play with. And I was wondering how you think about kind of, we're often abstracting time and we can kind of vignette through things. So um, how do you make time matter when you want players to kind of engage with a type of event, right? I think
So
yeah.
I think that, yeah, I think time-based adventures are probably like another whole category. And to be clear, by time-based, I don't mean like you've got to stop Doctor Doom in
Mm-hmm.
24 hours or he's going to blow up New York.
Mm-hmm.
That's a time pressure adventure,
Uh-huh.
and that's okay, right? But I would say use that technique very sparingly,
Right.
because time pressure can be just a real pain in the ass. It becomes really hard, and it really kind of takes a feeling of control away from the players,
Yeah.
right? Because they're like, we have to do this thing, and we have to do it now.
Right.
But a time-based adventure for me
Mm-hmm.
is like, okay, the players arrive in this town. On the first day when they arrive in this town, they're going to see this event happen.
Hmm.
And then, unless they do something really different or significant or something I'm not expecting, the next day, this thing will happen, right?
Mm.
And it allows you to kind of use time as a flow chart, right? Where
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
setting things up, you're creating a timeline and you can have a branching timeline, right? Like,
Yeah.
well, if the players defeat the villain, then, the next day everyone comes and throws them a party. But if they don't, then
Mm.
2 days later, the villain comes back and wants revenge. And so you can kind of just set everything up. Uh, Again, it's kind of like an event-based adventure, but you're basing it on time rather than
Yeah.
on the consequences of the player actions, and that can be really interesting too. I think it makes it. I think that makes the world feel very
Yeah.
believable, because
Right.
when the world is when events are transpiring in the world that are extraneous to the players, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like 2 days later, this thing happens, that makes the world seem lived in, right? It makes
Yeah.
it feel like you're really in a real world, and if we don't do the things that we're supposed to do, then maybe something bad's going to happen, right?
Or, I see the world react differently when I do. And one thing I love
Yes.
about that as a GM, a lot of times, like when I first started jamming, I would get like pretty overwhelmed by like, oh gosh, the branching timelines, right? Like, trying to predict what the players would do. And I've definitely gotten away from that a lot. But like, even if I just have one idea of a timeline of like, okay, what happens in this world, in this place they're in for this plot line? If the players do nothing, if they stay in the tavern, like what would happen? Because I think that kind of prep or that question makes me think about the motivations of the people involved, and it kind of forces my brain to make all those components feel real to me, and then it makes it easier for me to play off of or riff off of, because I'm like, okay, this big bad is motivated by this sort of thing, and now I, the GM, really know that, and can kind of, again, it adds to the verisimilitude because of how it's forced me to think about how the world spins if the players don't act, and then react accordingly, because I kind of know, I don't know, it makes it real for me in a way.
Right. Right. I think the more you can do, like, we could do a whole video on prep, right? On GM prep, and the things that you can do. But the more sort of mental prep, like, which is what I would describe what you're talking about, right? Where you're not like writing down stats or creating maps or anything, but you're just thinking about, well, if this happens, then this would probably happen.
Right.
That's first of all, that's the kind of prep that I love, right? Because you can do that in the car, you can write while you're taking a shower or whatever. But I mean, it's also it's going to make your world feel richer if you've thought about that.
Absolutely. So when we sit down to think about an adventure, I've got game night coming up on Friday. What am I prepping for my home game? Like, what kinds of adventures and how, what's our menu of kinds of adventures we could build? I've definitely spent a lot of time like watching TV episodes and trying to think about, okay, how is this kind of little compartmentalized story different from that one? And one piece of advice that I totally forget where it comes from, but that I've heard is that there are only two kinds of stories. A stranger comes to town, and travelers go off instead of adventure or for some quest, right? But there's more than that. There are at least more kind of variations on that you can pick and choose from. So I don't know. What do you think? What do you like?
I think that there are. When you define your adventure that way, right? Like throw away all the stuff we just said about location based, and you're only thinking about, okay, what's the goal? What are the players after?
Narratively. Mm-hmm.
If you want to look at it that way, it's you can break it down, and I think that it's valuable to do so. And here's why. I think that, like, if you decide that, okay, this is going to be an exploration adventure, right? The classic, explore the dungeon, right? Find the weird stuff and the treasure and the monsters. Then figuring that out informs the kinds of things that you're going to have happen in that adventure, so that like once the players understand, okay, we're interested in exploring here, you don't want to necessarily throw something in that deviates from that, right? Keep the focus on exploration. No, you can, right? You can throw in you're exploring the dungeon, and then you find a prisoner, and now you have to rescue the prisoner. But recognize that just became a different adventure, right?
Yeah.
Because we're no longer exploring. Now we're rescuing a prisoner and getting them to safety and whatnot. And so, I would say exploration is one. The other one that is obviously the, classic role-playing game one is the, find the object, find the thing.
Yeah.
You find the One Ring, find the crown of whoever, right? I mean, I think cynically we tend to use the term MacGuffin for that thing, right? The thing that everyone is after,
right?
And that's cool, right? That's that kind of adventure is interesting. It's more interesting the more dynamic you can make that, right? So that the thing isn't just the thing in the last room of the dungeon, right? But it is something that, the player characters get a hold of, but then the bad guys come and steal away, and then the player characters have to go back and get it again, and suddenly it becomes this sort of football that you're passing back and forth, and that's very dynamic and interesting, right? Otherwise, it's just this is why we are this is why we're doing the exploration adventure, is to find this thing, right? It really
Hmm.
just is really just an exploration.
Yeah. I think players really resonate when they feel like they kind of know what their character's goal is pretty strongly too. It doesn't mean there's not, and I think that can be really nebulous, but as long as they can kind of have something to hang on to, right? They know that they're getting paid to explore this country and go find adventures in it. They know that the goal is exploring, and they're playing toward where story lives if they are exploring. If
Yes.
the goal is, go find a thing, maybe it's do it any way you want. Maybe it's do it quietly or sneaky. Go infiltrate, and it is as a variation of explore, right? I
Right.
think getting sometimes that nuance can be really useful to make sure all the players kind of are on the same page. If three people are infiltrating and one person is swinging from the chandeliers exploring, that's a moment where we've disconnected what the goal actually is. So I think making sure your players kind of all have are picking up on at least a same goal. Maybe you've designed an interesting location and there's several things they could do in here, and as long as they're all kind of getting to a similar goal, you're probably not going to come into too much party conflict. But
Right. There's a way, this just occurred to me, right? We
mm,
can talk about these goals
mm,
sort of with an example, right?
okay,
So let's talk about the example. So there's a space station, you're playing a science fiction game,
okay,
and aliens have infested,
mm,
some terrible alien has infested the thing, the
okay,
space station, right? So you can have an exploration adventure, which
mm-hmm,
is like, we don't know, we've just come upon this, we don't know what's in the space station, oh, it's
mm,
full of aliens, right?
yeah,
It could be that there's a space station, it's full of aliens, but there's this important bit of information in the station's computers. We have to get to the main computer to get that out, right?
yeah,
Like you were saying, right? We infiltrate the
mm-hmm,
thing maybe we're spying on the aliens to find out what they're trying to do. We could have a rescue adventure, right, where we go in and we get all the people off the station before they're eaten by aliens. Maybe we're just going there to just wipe out all the aliens and clean the space station free of their infestation, right?
mm-hmm,
Maybe we're going to go there and talk. Let's see if we can just reason with the aliens, right?
right,
We can have like we're a diplomatic envoy, and the aliens, maybe there's an intelligence there that we can talk to.
yeah,
Or maybe we're just trying to get off the station ourselves, right?
right,
And because like just get to the hangar deck and get on the shuttle, right?
yeah,
And so I think that that's an interesting exercise, because you've got the same thing, right? It might be the same map, you've
right,
got the same stats for the aliens, right? And all these things, right? But there's, well, whatever that was, 3, 6,
mm-hmm,
7 different, completely different adventures that you can
yeah,
do with that same sort of setup. Um, I think varying with those kinds of things can really give a lot of new life and spice to your game, right? Is if you take the idea that you have, but do something different with it, right? Think
yeah.
about the different goals.
So we want to talk about adventure hooks next. And do you feel like there's a space station that your players are somehow invested in and aliens have infested it? Is that kind of the adventure hook? And then all of these different ways that it could be solved is kind of, you could imagine, you could set the context where some of these goals would make sense as that your PCs might pursue. you know uh how do
Yeah,
you how do
you
you
mentioned
Mhm.
earlier the triggering event,
Right.
and lots of times I think people get they conflate and confuse
Mm,
the triggering event and the hook,
mm,
um, because the triggering event might be distress call, help,
right.
aliens have infested our space station,
Yeah.
right? Keep saying invested like they're they're putting money into the space station.
Love
But
it.
you might get the distress call, but that's not necessarily the hook, because the hook is the thing that you as the game master know
Mm,
will motivate the players.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the number one reason why published adventures are difficult to write,
I
right?
see.
Because you know what's going to motivate your players if you're the GM,
Theoretically.
probably without even thinking about it,
Yeah.
right? But how is, some
Yeah.
some game designer somewhere going to think of what's going to motivate your players? That's why lots of times adventures will have multiple hooks,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because maybe your players are influenced by money, but maybe they're influenced by helping people, right?
Yeah.
So once you know your characters, once you know the players, I
Yeah.
think is pretty easy, and it just becomes, how do you make that triggering event play into the hook?
Mm-hmm.
Like what kinds of things have you seen motivate players to use as hooks when you've run games?
The search for information, like dangling a bit of backstory, right? If I have a very backstory oriented character, if I have dangle a bit of backstory behind a, say, space station infested by or invested by aliens, I've noticed that like the other players might, be because of their connections to that player, that hook can be strong enough to drag the whole party along. Um, I think some players or some characters that you could build too are kind of going to be hooked by more things than others, right? Someone who's really motivated by curiosity or discovery, is, a kind of weaker hook might be strong enough to pull them. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of some other good like hooks I've seen. Uh,
That's a, that you make a really good point, right? That not all players, even in the
right.
same group, right? I think about that scene in Star Wars where Luke is all gaga over the pretty princess,
Uh-huh.
right? And that influences him, but it doesn't influence Han Solo.
Right.
So Luke then has to say, "Well, she's rich,"
Yeah.
right? And so,
Yeah.
like, think about that scene when you're when you're creating your adventure hooks. You might need to say to half of your players, oh, there's these innocent people in danger. And then to the other half, and they have some cool stuff.
Yeah. And sometimes if I'm not sure as a GM, I will ask a player, right? I'll say, "Oh, your character, maybe you're, especially if it's for a one shot or something, or if my players are okay kind of going at that meta level with me, I'll say, how did they convince you to go along with this, or what made you decide to come along for this absolutely outrageous adventure that you're going to go on?" And letting them fill in the blank can be really useful.
I think that's like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here is sort of GMing 101, and that's like GMing 201,
Yeah, maybe.
right? That is really a really good point, right? That you can literally just say to your players, okay, so you're at the space station and it's infested by aliens. Why are you here?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, I
And
love
maybe
that.
they'll all have different answers, right? But
Oh,
it's not a matter of getting them to say yes. It's presuming that they said yes and asking them
yeah.
why, right? Which is like you said, it's a very meta, and
Mhm.
not everyone is going to react to that well. But if they do, that can be really, really rewarding.
Yeah, I'm also interested, I guess, in how hooks feed forward on each other. Um, so, we've talked a bit about kind of like this one shot, an adventure here, an adventure there. But I think one of the thing I've seen is that if the players achieved a MacGuffin in the last adventure, and that MacGuffin has opened up new questions, new possibilities. The intensity, that's hard won information or an item, and so I think those, I always look for what they've accomplished, what they've recently brought on, see where that investment is, and the hooks usually write themselves off of that. I think. Um,
I think so too. I think that when it comes to a continuing storyline, like
mhm.
I think that I want to say that this actually comes from the world of comics, which of
Mm,
course have continuing storylines.
yeah.
That someone once said every answer should ask two more questions,
Ooh, love
right?
it.
And
Yeah.
so there's always something where that leads into the next adventure or whatever. And sometimes you can do that where that hook comes not at the end of the adventure,
Mm.
but in the middle of the adventure, right? Where um, the maybe the it's a silly example, right? But
Mhm.
they player characters are uh, do in the middle of a town and they're doing something and something is going on and they encounter some teenage boy and they have a conversation with him, right? And then they go off and finish their adventure and then they find out, oh, that teenage boy was actually,
Ooh.
the prince in disguise, right?
Yeah.
And now they have to go find him because he's missing, right? And so it's something that happened maybe 3 sessions ago, but now all of
Mm.
a sudden you're like, oh, that actually connects to this adventure, right? Which is
Mm.
kind of getting into um, something that we want to talk about. Maybe I'm looking at our show notes, and actually
Yep.
I'm skipping ahead a little bit, right? But that idea of weaving adventures together,
Yeah.
but that ties in really closely with hooks.
Yeah.
I think that a hook that is a callback, right?
Hmm.
That is remember when you guys were in the tavern and you saw those mysterious figures in the corner with the hoods so
Hmm.
you couldn't see their face. Well, now you see them and they're all standing outside the temple and they're doing a thing, right?
Yeah. Uh, um, I love that. So we're talking, we're about to get to interweaving adventures, but I think first, one thing I am always curious about is, so, an adventure probably has some goal, it has some hook, it has some goal, how the PCs kind of go about that adventure. Um, but like most good stories, they have rising, they have falling, they kind of have a shape to them, the shape to the narrative. Um, so, when you're outlining an adventure, you probably want to have a sense too of kind of uh, like, how does it start? What's some of the exciting high point middle bits? What's sort of what's sort of the conclusion-y bits, even if it's not as clear cut as that. But there's of course lots of writing about storytelling and structure, but there's also the simple 3-act structure. Do we want to
Right.
talk about how you apply that to adventure design?
Well, so I mean, the 3 act structure is really simple, right? It's act one, the problem's introduced.
Mm-hmm.
Act two, things get worse.
Mm-hmm.
Act three is the problem gets solved, right?
Mm.
Which is almost every story that's ever been told.
Yeah.
Certainly every story that you've ever seen in television or movies. And there's value to that, right?
Mm.
And there's certainly value in thinking about it, but there's also a danger, right?
Mm.
Because if you think about your whole story in that way, right, you need to stop for a minute and remember that, right, you're not the only storyteller here, right?
Right.
And you might say, okay, well, at the end of Act Two, then the players will, save the they'll find that teenage prince and
Yep.
he will tell them where the MacGuffin is,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe they won't do that,
Right.
right? Because it's a group storytelling experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so planning out the your adventure as a story is a useful exercise, but make sure that you don't allow it to hamstring you and to shoehorn the actions of the players.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Um, I, I also find that thinking about the different kind of acts of a adventure help me with pacing a little bit too.
Yes.
So even if I really go off the rails, I kind of at least know, even though things do not look at all like they did when they started, I know I'm still well within Act Two. Things getting worse or more complicated. Even if we're in some they've gone somewhere I totally didn't expect. I kind of know that's what I'm aiming for narratively. And I know we got to get, hopefully they're working their way toward getting to Act Three, in which they are resolving things or somehow, you know, um, contending with how things have gotten worse. So even just thinking about it in my head, I think it's helpful to know where I sit.
I
Um,
think that is absolutely right. I think that that I have gone on record multiple times saying that the key to good game mastering is all in pacing
Mm-hmm.
and timing. And you're right that the 3 act structure is great for
Mm-hmm.
managing your own pacing, right? To make sure that you're not spending 2 full sessions just spinning your wheels on act 1, right?
Yeah.
Before the good stuff happens in act 2 and the really exciting finish of act 3. That's really smart. Yeah.
So we've already alluded to this, but with callbacks and with the wonderful chaos that is collaborative storytelling, and with just kind of more interesting storytelling, it probably doesn't, you know, pop off with these perfect little units of adventure, right? There's probably a little weaving that happens. It probably, there could be foreshadowing or callbacks that kind of start to meld things together, or kind of circling back to places you've already been. So how do you think about, if you're sitting down to outline an adventure, do you, a lot of times I'm looking to already reuse components that I've used before because I'm lazy, the players are invested. I find a lot of value, and I kind of like the puzzle of seeing how content that came before or will come could weave its way or get peppered through adventures where it doesn't really belong. So I'm always looking for that, but I don't know, are there any like do's or don'ts or dangers, or is that just, most adventures will kind of do that naturally, whether you intend it or not, that they'll kind of bleed into one another? What's your
I think
experience there?
so, right? I mean, I started out this video by saying that adventures were kind of bullshit, and the reason is because there we don't have these, like you just said, right? These discrete units where
Mm-hmm.
you go from A to B to C, right? What you probably have in a campaign anyway is, if we call back to the 3 act structure, right? You might have act 1 and 2 of adventure A,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then you might have act 1 of adventure B before you actually even get to act 3 of adventure A, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you start weaving things, right? And you create this sort of pattern where, well, let's use Numenera, right?
Mm-hmm.
So player characters are in town. They go and they investigate the ancient ruin of the prior worlds, and they do a lot of exploration. But then they come back to town. Then they start hearing about some problem, and there's a call to action. Um, but they say, well, that's all great, and we will take care of that. But we've got to go back and finish what we started in the prior world's ruin, right? And so that kind of weaving back and forth, it creates a very, I want to say, sort of organic flow, right?
Yeah.
That without having sort of this, okay, we're done with this adventure,
Yeah.
what's the next adventure, right?
I also like that it kind of, not every game, not every Thursday night game session is the same as the rest, right?
Right.
Maybe you don't have the same players that you had. Maybe you have a different player complement, or it's a little more low energy. And so I think one of the great benefits of kind of leaving some threads unresolved, kind of being in Act 1 of one adventure and Act 2 of another, is that the players can kind of opt, okay, what are we doing today? Are we really doggedly going to pursue this one that we're close to the end of? Do we want to kind of, recoup? Maybe I want to have some personal thing I want to get up to, and I can introduce Act 1 of a new arc or a new adventure. I think when you look at things and are open to the way they might interweave or kind of wander around, you can kind of play off the energy of the players a little better too, and they get to pick and they get to be a little more full of agency as they pursue their various goals on these adventures, on these bullshit adventures.
Yeah,
So
there's another tool too that it happens sort of organically. It almost very rarely happens through planning, but that doesn't mean you can't try to plan them, and that's the subplot, right?
okay,
So
right.
you've got the players who were playing Numenera, and they're going to go into the prior world ruin, and they're going to explore it and looking for things, and maybe in the last adventure, they were gifted a weird artifact, but they don't know exactly how it works.
Right.
Right. And so even as they are going through the main plot of exploring this ancient ruin, right, a couple of the players, maybe, when they stop and rest and whatnot,
Mhm.
are fiddling around with this weird device, and they kind of figure out what it does, and suddenly it becomes like this subplot of figuring out exactly what it does and why it does that. And that's a really simple example of a subplot, but it's like a different, smaller story that's going
Yeah.
on in the context of the larger story. Right. We see this in television shows all the time, right? They call it an A plot and a B plot,
Right.
right? Where there's, some big story, but then there's a couple of other characters and they're involved in their own little shenanigans or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can use that same technique in role playing games to really good effect, I think.
Yeah, I like doing that when if the players are just in a weird mood and they are on a shopping adventure, right? That's a great time to go, okay, how can I, have them come upon a rumor, right? I often think about this big stuff going on in the background and like to see if I can't pepper in some details there so that it uh even though they're off on a shopping adventure, it kind of builds towards something I know is happening in the background. So I think there's lots of ways to go about, bringing those elements in.
Yeah, that's a great point. The subplot can then even become
Yeah,
a major plot later,
right.
right? Or it can be the act one, like you were saying, of the next adventure.
Hmm.
That's it doesn't have to have that. A
Hmm.
subplot can just be a smaller story on its own, but it can also lead to something bigger. So if you've got the players are all in the market and they're shopping and they're doing whatever, and you've got somebody else, and there's a cute guy that they're flirting with,
Yeah,
right? That might just be a subplot of, oh, do I start a
yeah.
relationship with this guy?
Hmm.
Or, he might know of a secret map into the place where the player characters want to go, right?
Yeah. And playing that by ear, I think is always
Yeah.
in your court. So we've talked a lot about kind of proactive ways to think about outlining adventures and how to approach them. But what are some like common, you know, ways that things you might want to avoid? So as you're sitting there, things you want to keep on the horizon to not the traps that you don't want to fall into, right?
Right. What's your danger zone? What trap do you find yourself potentially
Ah,
falling into?
I would say uh, I've learned to work with my particular home group of players, but I think more than other groups when I run games at cons, people know they're here for one shot. They're going to be invested in things. So one of my common mistakes has been to think that I know what would motivate the players and to put that in front of them, and then just to really be surprised as they are maybe figuring out their characters and are deciding, oh, maybe my character won't want to do this and why, right? So sometimes they're kind of deliberately being a problem child, my darlings. But
That can happen.
so one way I've solved that, of course, is by saying, you have all decided to go do this thing. What is?
Right.
Tell me your hook. Um, Other ways might be that there are multiple ways that there are multiple things or multiple hooks that I've kind of prepared to entice them. So making sure multiple uh, like paths lead to something I'm interested in showing off. So just sort of not getting too specific about the on ramp into this adventure and thinking about, okay, they might find themselves this way or that way. So I know some ways of how to avoid it now. What about you?
I think that, yeah. So I would call what you're describing the wrong stakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've
Right.
you create an adventure and you say, oh, and in the galaxy, the shipping lanes will be in danger, and the
Yeah,
players just kind of say, who cares, right? I don't want,
exactly.
I just want to get my own spaceship. That's my
Yep.
thing, right? So choosing the wrong stakes is a bad one. I would say, um, here's a pit. So I've I've been running games literally for 40 years now.
Yep.
And the problem that
Mm-hmm.
comes with that is repetition, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you just start to kind of go back to the same tropes,
Right.
the minute you hear players say something like, oh, let's not help this imprisoned person in the dungeon, because every time we do that in one of Monte's games, that person ends up betraying us and turning into a monster or whatever, right? And the minute you hear somebody say that, you know that they're metagaming, but at the
Mm-hmm.
same time they're doing it because you have fallen into the trap of always kind of doing the same thing, of this
Right.
repetition. And so there are ways out of that, and one of them is to just constantly, like every time you think of an idea to introduce in your game, think of another one and go with the second idea,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because your first idea is probably, sort of your go-to one, right? It's the
Right.
well-worn road, right? And if it's, if it's always, well, there's a secret door on the floor because there's a basement and there's always dangerous and interesting stuff in a basement, right? Well, don't do that.
Yeah.
If that's what you always do, if that's
Right.
the first thing that comes to your mind, right? Uh, have the adventure take place somewhere else,
Yeah.
not in the basement.
Mm.
I think that you can look at other things, like even if you're the kind of person who says, I always make my own adventures, I never use adventures written by someone else, it's still valuable to
Mm-hmm.
occasionally pick up an adventure written by someone else and just read it and think, oh, right, I would not have thought to do that, right?
Yeah.
And you don't even have to use that, but it's like a little, a jog to your brain of
Yeah.
inspiration of, oh, I forget that the players could also do that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I think that's a great point. So one of the things that I have also experienced when really trying to be original, do something that, just if I get, sometimes I get too up in my head about not being repetitious or not being, trying to be novel. And so sometimes I had made the mistake of hiding some part of the adventure that I did not realize was a critical, linchpin of their understanding of what's going on, hiding it in a place that they can't access, right? Or they're just, or I think it's the most obvious thing. They will think of this first. They will go to it. It's the obvious thing. I can count on that. No, incorrect. They will ignore the obvious thing. And I think this kind of runs into what might be considered like a bottleneck or something, some part of the adventure that is kind of slowing things down, or some piece they can't, access. And so I definitely found like, oh no, they kind of need to know the motivation of these strange squid people. And the one who has like the two people who have telepathy devices that could actually communicate with them are not remembering to use them, or are not, you know,
Right.
this adventure takes on a very different tone without that piece of information. So that's one piece I've run into.
Yeah, yeah. Or even worse, things just come to a dead halt,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Because maybe the squid aliens are just going to leave if the player characters don't remember that they can talk to them telepathically, or don't
Right.
think of it, or whatever, right? And so, oh, adventure over, they're gone,
Yeah.
right? Or sort of the classic one is, there's an important piece of information that is behind a secret
Oh,
door that the players don't think to look at, or it's behind a locked door and they just fail their lock picking check.
yeah. Right.
Oh, adventure over, right?
Yeah.
So you don't want to create bottlenecks, and the way around that is just the obvious, right? And that is have multiple paths, right? And that's important too, because that gives the players way more agency. We give
Mm-hmm.
the players more control over things, because they can choose to go, this way or this way, or a way that you weren't even expecting,
Yeah.
right? But if you have the one thing they absolutely must have, and it's behind a locked door, then you're making that impossible, right? You're
Yep.
making it impossible for the players to come up with their own crazy way of solving the problem.
Yeah. And so I think how I get around that usually is just by I I've run into the problem often enough that I kind of have the process of saying, oh, is this important to the adventure? Is there an important thing? Or is there a scene I'm really excited by? I look for multiple on ramps, right? I say, okay, they could get that here. Maybe one of the squid people has a telepathy thing and is drawn to one of the players for some reason, right? So just always noodling on multiple paths has really helped me, because a lot of times I don't anticipate, I don't see the bottleneck before it comes. But if I'm always thinking about kind of a sea of clues, or you know more of a probability space of stuff that could happen and ways they could engage with it, then I'm prepared. I feel like I'm in the right fighting stance to dynamically react to when the players surprise me. So that's how I try to get around it, I think.
I think the classic pitfall
Mm,
that people talk about, of course, is railroad adventures, right?
right.
Railroading, where you just like, the adventure has to go this way. You have to do this and this and this in this order,
Right.
and then you'll get to the end.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously it's called railroad because the player characters all feel like they're just passengers on a train, just kind of watching the adventure go by.
Right.
And they have to go in the direction that you're making them go, because that's where the tracks go.
Right.
And the thought processes that we're talking about here, for avoiding some of these other problems, will also help with railroading.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about multiple paths toward conclusion, multiple paths toward success,
Yeah.
I think is really important. But I'll go so far as to say, don't plan what the end of the story is going to look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't even think about it. Don't even let
Yeah.
yourself think about it, right? Because you're going to subconsciously be steering the players toward what you think the resolution should be, and
Right.
that's not group storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would, when I'm playing in the game that I'm running now, which is Invisible Sun, and Invisible Sun has the advantage that the players have lots of options.
Mm-hmm.
They have lots of different things they can do. I couldn't keep track of all of their potential,
Yeah.
weird magical things that they could pull out, even if I wanted to. So I will present them with just problems, and I won't even think ahead of time what the
Yeah.
solution is. I have no idea how they're going to deal with, this the seemingly impossible thing. But then, of course, 15 minutes later, they've dealt with it, right? Because
Yeah.
they're creative, because they have interesting characters that have lots of different avenues of success.
Yeah.
And so, that's the extreme, right?
Right.
Because if you come up with a problem and you don't think about the solution, you're risking creating a bottleneck.
Yeah. Yep.
So you've kind of got to figure out how to navigate that space.
Yeah. I've also heard it said, there's a difference between a railroad and a roller coaster. Sometimes, you know, there can be parts of your adventure that you can set up that will be really fun reveals. Like, that NPC they met is a prince in disguise, and it's going to be a fun moment when you reveal that later on, right? You can kind of have that planned out. And so I think finding the fun of the truth of the matter behind it, players can, and different players are more, more exploratory or more sandboxy, and some are really here for, I'm excited for something to unfurl before me. So I think it's also about finding the right amount of structure for your game, for you as a GM, for you as a player, like what kinds of adventures you like. I think there's a lot of room in between kind of those two extremes of adventure engagement.
And even though this is a very GM focused video,
Yeah.
if there are any players who are watching, right, and you see the obvious opportunity for fun,
Yes.
take it, right?
Yeah.
I wrote an adventure for D&D, Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, and a
Mm-hmm.
big part of it was a mine, and the player characters come upon a mine car on a track, right? And we've all seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and what kind of hijinks that can lead to.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting to see in play tests and hearing about people playing through it. You have there's two kinds of players, right? There's a kind of
Yeah.
player who's like, let's get in, this is going to be crazy fun, right? And then there's the kind of people who are like, no, there's
Mm-hmm.
no way I'm getting in there
Right.
because I know that it will lead to hijinks. And what's the point of that mindset, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that'll be crazy fun. I don't want to do that, right? I don't understand that point of view at all.
Mm-hmm.
But resist that temptation. Be open to fun, crazy things. Be
Yeah.
open to be open to adventure hooks. Jump in and have fun.
Yeah, that's a great point. Um, so there's a lot more in your best game ever about thinking about adventures, thinking about storytelling, how players contribute to storytelling, how GMs prep they can do. There's going to be so much in there. So we've not touched on it all, but I hope some of this is helpful to any of you who are either trying to freshen up how you think about adventures or are trying to kind of learn your process for the first time. So thank you so much for watching, and check out yourbestgameever.com if you want to look deeper into the book. And we would love for this to be a broader conversation, because I think everybody brings different experience to the table. So, talk about it in the comments below, talk about it on social media with the hashtag #YourBestGameEver. And I would love to know any concrete tips or tricks or funny stories about adventures gone wrong or gone really, really unexpectedly right. So please reach out, and let's all have our best games ever. Thank you so much.
Bye.